when it comes to a relationship, any kind of relationship, when it comes to an end, sometimes there's a lot of things goes on with us. There's questions haven't been answered. There's things we would like to be able to do better or undo. Sometimes if it was a relationship with someone who was very toxic, narcissistic, manipulative, it can feel like there's unfinished business. Again, there's things we haven't put right. There's things we haven't got to say. We haven't got the apology. We haven't got the acknowledgement. One way or another, we haven't had a sense of closure. That leaves a lot of questions going around in our head. A trauma bond tends to form in abusive relationships, toxic relationships, and it's usually formed through this cycle of highs. Sometimes they're intense highs. There could be passion, fun, games, affection, but there's also lows. Okay, there's rejection, there's abuse, there's manipulation, there's constant criticism. You go through this cycle and it creates an attachment style, this emotional attachment style that can be very similar to an addiction. So what happens is we can become hyper alert, hypersensitive to the rejection, to the criticism. We're always looking for the next insult. We're always looking for the next criticism, things like that. So we're in a state of high alert. But then we're getting the good stuff. We're getting the laughs, the funs, the games, things like that. We're getting the affection. And that's giving us like little dopamine hits. That's making us feel good. That's alleviating the stress we're in. So it becomes this kind of addictive cycle. We're always maybe alert, but at the same time, we're hoping for the good stuff and we're chasing that. We're trying to encourage that. We keep on compromising. We keep on backing down. We keep on giving them what they want in the hope of getting the good stuff. Now, when we do get the good stuff, very conditional and it's very short-lived. Trying to go no contact with someone or some people like that can be very challenging. In some ways, it can trigger like withdrawal symptoms and it can cause things like anxiety. It can cause things like self-doubt, especially if they might be trying to contact you. They're making a lot of promises. They're offering to give you things, to do things for you. And the pull towards that can be very, very strong. If you've decided to go no contact, chances are this is not something you decided at a whim. This has maybe been something that's been going on for a very long time. You've come to realize this is not good for you. This is hurting you. And it's best to be out of the situation, best to be out of that dynamic. However, that draw, that lack of closure, that unfinished business, the pull of that can be very, very strong. Sometimes we can have contact, but it's more like a managed contact. Because sometimes there might have to be some kind of contact. Maybe we work in the same building. Maybe we've had kids together or something. There could be something. So there needs to be some kind of contact. So maybe it's about managed contact. But other than that, if it is just breaking off contact, that pull's going to be very strong. Something you might find helpful is to acknowledge the bond that's there. Acknowledge the trauma bond. Acknowledge that what you're feeling is a real psychological response. It's not a sign of weakness. It's not a sign of true love. Even though if it was a person, if it was like a relationship, a romantic relationship, they may have qualities that are very attractive, the things that attracted you to them in the first place. But it's not necessarily true love, nor, as I said, is it a sign of weakness. Educate yourself on the nature of a trauma bond, okay? It can help to normalize your experiences and also reduce things like self-blame. Sometimes we blame ourselves for the situation we find ourselves in. Whenever we take responsibility, that sounds a little more empowering. It means there's something we can do about it. But that awareness on the nature of a trauma bond can help to weaken it, and it can help you to do the things you need to do to be able to weaken that bond. Set firm boundaries, boundaries with yourself. Okay, and this is going to require things like self-discipline. I think it begins with intent. Okay, we need to do something with intent. We have a plan, we have a goal, and it's how do we get there from here. So that plan, those boundaries, could involve things like you block them on social media. If that's what you want to do, you don't want to hear from them, you don't want to know what they're up to, who they're with now or whatever. It could be blocking their phone number, but you also observe the times that you feel drawn to maybe unblock them and have a look to see what they're up to, or you're tempted to send them a text. Observe those cravings, but observe them without acting on them. You observe the temptations, but you do it with a curiosity. Try to track when it happens, when those urges hit. It could be things like when you're feeling stressed. It could be things like when you're feeling relaxed. It could be when you're on your own, when you're alone. Whatever it happens to be, try to track those urges, those triggers. When you're aware of those, you can counter them with different little obstacles you might put in your path, affirmations you might want to tell yourself, or some kind of distraction. The short-term distractions can be very, very useful. What you're really doing is you're trying to maintain a new way of being, and that isn't always easy. But the thing is, the more we try, the more we do things consistently, what we're doing is we are rewiring pathways in our brain. The maintenance after a period of time stops being maintenance. It starts to become the new normal. What you might find yourself doing as well, I mentioned earlier on how it can sometimes be like a withdrawal from an addiction. So those little highs you used to get, the sound of them laughing, giving you little gifts, little moments of affection and things like that, these would have been giving you little highs. Now remember, they didn't last very long and they were very, very conditional. So what it could be is trying to engage in dopamine fasting. You can do that by engaging in self-care routines. So if you've committed to a period of no contact, let's say that's a month, whatever, or 90 days or something like that. When you commit to that, try to stick to it. What you're doing is you're allowing your brain's reward system to reset, and you can fill that void. You can fill that with things that are in your own best interest. Healthy activities, learning new skills, exercises, forming new relationships, healthy relationships with other people, practicing things like self-compassion. And these things can help boost like a natural dopamine, our natural feel-good factor, our long-term gratification as opposed to the short-term. It can also help us to rebuild independence when we start doing things in our own best interest, things that we enjoy, doing the things that maybe we're disapproved of, like learning that new skill, applying for that job, applying for that promotion, reconnecting with people you might have lost contact with. Something that can come up is very, very common is the things like the rumination, where we start to replay almost every interaction. Again, there's this unfinished business. I often say our brains do not like things that don't make sense. Why we keep going over the same thing again and again, where it's like we're trying to find a new piece of information, or we are rehearsing conversations that we imagine we're going to have at some point in the future. Try to limit your exposure to reminders. Again, that could be things like social media, seeing them on social media, mutual friends, photographs, mementos, things like that. Trying to redirect your thoughts. It's the thing whenever we're ruminating, whenever our minds wander, that's what they do. But with practice, we try to bring ourselves back into the present, gently bring our mind back to where it needs to be, focusing on things like the future goals, focusing on things like growth, rather than trying to fix the past or idealize someone. When you're doing this as well, I mentioned a moment ago about the setbacks. I mentioned things like that bond, how hard it can be, and we talked about the maintenance, how after a while it becomes the new normal. But even during that process, because the bonds can be so strong, sometimes there are going to be setbacks. That's not necessarily a bad thing. There can be waves of doubt, self-doubt. There could be waves of temptation, but it is maybe about trying to view that as part of the detox. Now, if you slip up, whatever it is, yeah, you might feel disappointed, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're back where you started. It just means you restart from where you are, not necessarily back to the beginning, but from where you are. Restart without judgment, acknowledge it, take ownership of it, but try to find a way to move forward. In the case of something like an abusive relationship, like a violently abusive relationship even, can involve getting in touch with professionals who can help you to develop an exit strategy, okay? People who can give you practical help, advice and guidance. Try to maintain that no contact by advocating for your own needs.